Thank you for coming to today's academic seminar. So the PLAAS academic seminars usually happen on Tuesdays, but today we have Professor Ian Scoones on a Wednesday. He was already attending another event, postgraduate training workshop, so it was convenient to have it on a Wednesday. So welcome once again. So today's discussion will focus on putting land redistribution back on the agenda towards the ICARRD 2026 conference. For those of you who may not be aware of what ICARRD stands for, is the International Conference on Agrarian Reform and Development, which is happening in Colombia in a few weeks' time. So just a brief introduction on who Prof. Ian Scoones is. Professor Ian Scoones is a professorial fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. And by training is an agricultural ecologist, but he has written widely on land reform, pastoralism, and uncertainty. And one of the most widely debated books is called Land Reform Myths and Realities, which interrogates some of the myths or misperceptions about the outcomes of land reform in Zimbabwe. So, Professor Ian Scoones, before we start, I'm just going to mention a few things about the structure of the session. We are going to have the main presentation for 30 minutes, and then the remainder of the seminar is going to be dedicated to the question and answer section. So colleagues who are online, you are free to type your questions on Zoom chat so that we can relay your questions to the speaker. Professor Ian Scoones, over to you.
Thank you, Farai, and thank you for the invitation. Ruth gave me this title, which is a kind of large and ambitious title, appropriate to PLAAS, I guess, linking it to the debates that are going to happen in Cartagena in Colombia in a couple of weeks' time, that I mentioned. So ICARRD, as will be mentioned a number of times, the International Conference on Agrarian Reform and Rural Development, +20. So 2026 is 20 years, more or less exactly, since the first ICARRD, which was held in Brazil in 2006, which was organized by the FAO. And this one is organized by the Colombian government together with FAO technical support. So what is ICARRD? I'm going to use a little quote from Ward Anstute, who's the land tenure lead in FAO, on a recent LinkedIn post. He says, ICARRD isn't just a meeting, it's a platform for real change. At ICARRD+20, governments will reaffirm their commitment to equitable land reforms and sustainable, inclusive transformation. It invites voices from around the world to shape policy, law, and practice so that rural areas are not left behind in global development efforts. It's about land justice, food security, and giving rural communities a stronger voice in their own futures. So the first ICARRD gave birth to what became the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure and land, fisheries and forests in the context of food security. That's the title of the document. I can never remember it. It's called the voluntary guidelines because it's so much of a mouthful. But lots of governments after ICARRD in 2006 rallied around this idea that we needed to think about land governance more seriously. And around half the governments in Africa and 25% of the governments around the world have signed up to some processes of land governance reform associated with the voluntary guidelines. But the question now, and will be debated intensively in a couple of weeks, is what will ICARRD+20 produce? The voluntary guidelines are a useful step on a journey. I'm not going to stand here and sit here and criticize them when there are critiques of them. But I think now, at this moment, something more radical, more forward-looking, and more centred on land redistribution is necessary, not just land governance and tenure reform, which means actually in practice, many governments can simply do very little. Now, ICARRD currently, and I found this on an FAO document, which is a flyer for ICARRD+20, has a number of principles. And I can give you a flavour of them. That the ICARRD must be based on a national and inclusive dialogue. It must focus on appropriate agrarian reform. It must be participatory in approach. It must support countries through capacity building and technical assistance. It must facilitate applied research and technology transfer. It must focus on decentralization. It must put in place administrative mechanisms to secure land rights. It must strengthen the role of the state. It must support local knowledge and experiences. It must be based on partnerships and solidarity of farmers' organizations. Well, great, fine words, but where are we going to move to the specificity of what, for example, appropriate land reform might mean? So I want to suggest that the conference should really particularly, amongst other things, focus on land redistribution as a route to addressing some of the deepening inequalities in land ownership around the world. Because I think this is a major challenge globally. So why is land redistribution important in my view? Let me quote. Roughly 80% of the estimated 608 million farms across the globe are family farms, but they're being squeezed out as big landowners and corporations extend their hold over land. Estimates suggest that the largest 1% of farms now occupy over 70% of the world's agricultural land, while the bottom 40% hold just 3%. This threatens the livelihoods of 2.5 billion people who depend directly on land, and it produces a global food system skewed towards a handful of commodity crops grown at scale for distant markets. Redistributing control of farms, farming, and land ownership as part of a wider commitment to reducing inequality at all scales must be a major policy priority. So that's an excerpt from the introduction, at the moment only a draft introduction of a book that myself, Ruth, and other colleagues are editing currently called Redistributed Land Reform, Challenging Inequality in the 21st Century. And it draws on a number of cases from around the world, from Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, India, the Philippines, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Scotland. 8 different countries, 4 different continents. And it makes the case that land reform does remain unfinished business, that it isn't dead, as some people have suggested. That there is ongoing processes of land reform, and the efforts in the last few decades, even in the midst of neoliberal policy, which seem to be against redistribution, redistributed land reform efforts have taken place. Third, the redistribution to smallholder farms can boost productivity. That's the inverse relationship, well known. And if well supported with a wider policy of agrarian reform, can have wider impacts on economic growth. And fourth, that redistribution efforts can offer alternatives to this large-scale corporate agriculture, supporting local experiments in sovereignty, alternative food systems, and revival of rural areas. So that's, as it were, the argument for land reform and redistributed land reform. But why is it important within the context of addressing inequality? There is a wider debate these days about the problems of inequality, but many people push back against that and say, well, surely inequality is a good thing, it drives competition. And anyway, in the agricultural sector, informal smallholder agriculture is backward, we just need a transformation to large-scale modern system. Well, I want to counter those arguments and suggest that actually addressing inequality has important implications across the board, but including in the land sector and in agriculture. So there are plenty of arguments against persistent inequality. Every year, Oxfam produces a report around the time of the Davos meeting held in Switzerland. It was produced in January this year. And this year it documented how billionaire wealth rose over 16% in 2025 alone, to a total value of $18.5 trillion. And this has been up 81% since 2020. While they say 1 in 4 people globally face hunger. Billionaires, of course, and this was the argument of the report this year, use wealth to gain political influence, shape policies, create political narratives, owning media companies, social media platforms. The wealthiest 1% are responsible for emissions that could cause, they claim, 1.3 million heat-related deaths by the end of the century. And there is a need, Oxfam argues, for massive redistribution of the ultra-wealthy to end extreme poverty and the destruction of democracy by corporate power. Now, that message probably didn't go down terribly well at Davos, but actually mainstream economics, beyond the campaigning groups, is latching on to the idea that addressing inequality has wider effects. The World Inequality Report, which is led by Thomas Piketty and others, esteemed economists working on global economic questions, produced their flagship report at the end of last year and showed that the richest 10% of the world's population, earning 75% of wealth, that includes assets, including land, housing, and so on. And the bottom half of those, of the total, own just 2%. In almost every region, they claim the top 1% was wealthier than the bottom 90% combined. And wealth inequality, including around land, is increasing rapidly around the world. The result, they say, is a world in which a tiny minority commands unprecedented financial power, while billions remain excluded from basic economic stability. Piketty also pointed out in his classic work that this wealth gets embedded in societies across generations unless there is active efforts at redistribution. Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, esteemed economists again, produced a report in advance of the G20 held here in South Africa in October. And their letter, published in advance of the G20, stated, extreme concentrations of wealth translate in undemocratic concentrations of power, unraveling trust in our societies, and polarizing our politics. The global question of inequality is such a threat to global prosperity, they argue, that it needs to be put on a parallel with climate as one of the global challenges. Now, this is not a new debate. Much earlier, 2009, there was a famed book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett called The Spirit Level, argued that inequality, not just poverty, not just levels of poverty, had all sorts of negative effects on societies. Social problems, crime, poor health, low educational achievement are more closely linked to the gap between rich and poor within a country rather than the absolute wealth of said country. Inequality causes status anxiety, insecurity, competition, leading to stress, breakdown in trust and community life, they argue. And the negative outcomes mean more equal societies perform better across the board. Now, of course, we know that, and speaking in South Africa, obviously we know that inequality is not good. But how much debate is there really on redistribution amongst all this hand-waving about the problems of injustices of inequality? Not a lot. There are talks of wealth taxes in Europe. Progressive income taxation is fairly standard, but often the rich find loopholes and escape. But the direct transfer of resources, including land, hardly gets a mention. You look at those reports, famous reports done by important people, the World Inequality Report or Stiglitz's G20 report, land redistribution itself didn't get mentioned once. And this is a bit surprising, given the fact that many countries around the world have extended rural populations, agrarian populations, and surprising also because the history of growth and prosperity in East Asia is very much on the back of land reform experiences. And we've seen a rush of enthusiasm at revitalizing East Asian experiences around industrial policies, but very often forgetting the fact that those were built on experiences of land reform before, whether in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and China after the reforms. Even the economists sung the praises of East Asian land reform as a precursor to economic growth in an article in 2017, which took me aback when I read it. But let me quote from it. Land reform started with rent controls and reforms to tenancy. They're speaking here about Taiwan. Sales of formerly Japanese-owned land followed. Then in 1953 came appropriation. The share of land tilled by the owner rose from just over 30% in 1945 to 64% in 1960. Yields of sugar and rice leapt. New markets sprang up for exotic fruits and vegetables. Household farmers dominated early exports. Crucially, income inequality shrank back thanks to the new farmer capital. Less spent on food imports, more money in Taiwanese pockets, and new entrepreneurialism. Farming was, the Economist says, was the start of Taiwan's economic miracle. What happened elsewhere, they asked, elsewhere in that broader region? Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand could have followed Taiwan's example, but they didn't. Their economies have done far worse. Here, the state favors agribusiness and plantations over small farmers. There's a yawning gap in income between countryside and city. Inequality, they argued, has political consequences too. In South Korea and Taiwan, more inclusive agricultural growth prefigured, it's debated, it must be said, the inclusive politics of today's thriving democracies. And again, by contrast, in Southeast Asia, cronyism and inertia were the consequences, and insurgencies and rural unrest follows. If done well, the Economist concludes, land reform starts to look cheap. Well, there is an argument, and based on a lot of research from the history of that region, obviously not replicable in other areas, but interesting nevertheless, that redistributive land reform needs to be part and parcel of the debate about inequality. If inequality is emerging into a global debate about what to do about development, land redistribution needs to be part of that. And ICARRD, in 2 weeks' time, must be central to that move. Now, some of you will say, well, this is all pie in the sky, idealistic nonsense from lefty researchers and so on. But actually, there's a lot of reform that is going on around the world. Often it's under the radar, it takes multiple forms, it's not in the standard pattern of state expropriation and land to the tiller of the classic reforms of the 50s and 60s. And the book that I mentioned that we're working on as part of the Land Redistribution Initiative, which involves IDS, my institution, PLAAS as well, ISS, Cornell, and others, is exploring these in these different countries across continents. Those of you who attended the fantastic Land, Life and Society conference at UWC, organized by PLAAS in October, may recall that we had a double panel on some of these experiences and a fantastic plenary discussion, and you should check out the recording of that. Maybe, Deshni, you could put it in the chat. But why do we want to encourage this conversation? Surely land reform is off the agenda since the 1980s. It's old hat. Land redistribution is simply not going to happen. The politics are against it. But it's clearly not completely dead, and the experience is very varied. And it's important to reflect on those experiences, positive and negative. So the dominant experience since the 1980s has been the so-called willing seller, willing buyer reforms, the market-led reforms, which were pushed by the World Bank, that existed in South Africa, a long time, that exist around the community right to buy approach in Scotland, existed in Bolivia and various other places. There was, in certain places, at certain moments, some patterns of expropriation by the state on behalf of smallholders and others for land reform. Zimbabwe is obviously an example. The Philippines also an example. Some parts of the Brazilian experience examples. There were also tenancy reforms, and the work that Rajanya Bose has been doing on West Bengal, giving tenants rights as part of tenancy reforms, is an interesting angle on redistribution rights as well as land. And there's a whole set of processes, particularly in Latin America, but also in the Philippines and elsewhere, where granting rights to indigenous territories and Afro-descendant territories has been an important part of redistributive reform. And there have been a variety of other redistributions around changing property relationships and land control, which can be thought of as redistributive, that exist within capitalist relationships of contracting, of lease arrangements, of joint ventures, and so on. All of these reforms, when looking back across all these 8 case studies that we've been examining, happened at certain moments, particular conjunctures, where political alliances within the state, within the bureaucracy, within social movements coalesced that allowed reforms to happen. What's very clear is repeating these or designing these and translating these to other places is virtually impossible. It has to exist in that political moment. But mobilizing around these opportunities surely is an opportunity for people in the state and people in civil society to think about if redistribution is to remain on the agenda. So what have we learned about the outcomes of redistributed land reform? Let's look very briefly at some of the country cases in this forthcoming book. Even in this neoliberal era where land reform and land redistribution is not seen as the big thing, it's not central to policy, it's not central to funding, it's been actually quite important when you look at what actually happened in terms of scale. So in Bolivia, for example, there were 2 phases of reform. First, the classic reform in the 1950s, which broke up the larger states. But then there was a second reform, which was associated with titling and redistribution to indigenous people, that transferred around 6.6 million hectares of state land to smallholders and indigenous communities. In Brazil, from 1985 to 2024, across a range of different regimes, some leftist, some not, 9,971 agrarian reform settlements were created, settling about 1.2 million families, largely a result of pressure from social movements and in alliance with particular parts of the state. In Colombia, after the 1994 land law, the willing seller, willing buyer land redistribution occurred, but on a very limited scale. But there has been, as I mentioned, this recognition of indigenous people from Afro-descendants territories, as well as the restitution of abandoned land due to the war. And in recent years, way below the targets of 3 million hectares, about 500,000 hectares have been redistributed to smallholders. In India, as I mentioned, land reform unfolded unevenly across different states in India, and it was in the left-orientated states, including in West Bengal, where Rajanya is doing her studies, where redistribution and also tenancy reforms happened. And there, around 7% of the state's operating area, agricultural operating area, was transferred up until the 1990s, 6 to 7 times more than the average in the country. Very small parcels, but still significant. In the Philippines, very substantial amount of areas has been transferred over a series of land reforms, but a significant increase in redistribution occurred in the 90s that allowed around 8 million hectares, benefiting 5 million peasants, together with leasehold reforms and so on, and the allocation of ancestral titles and indigenous lands. Zimbabwe, as we mentioned, perhaps one of the most dramatic land reforms of the last century, took place after 1980, but particularly after 2000, when about 28% of the country's land area was redistributed to both smallholder and medium-scale farms. South Africa has been, since 1994, a country with policy ambitions towards redistribution, but not meeting targets anywhere near. And around 6% of total commercial farmland was transferred through redistribution since 1994. In Scotland, where land ownership is even more unequal than many of the countries I've mentioned already, 433 people apparently own over 3 million hectares of land, half the country's privately owned land. About 250,000 hectares has been redistributed since the Land Reform Act of 2003, a very small amount, and communities have taken this over and begun experimenting with new food and livelihood systems, central to debates about regenerating rural areas. Now, I mean, that's just a very brief overview, and I don't want to give a rose-tinted picture, even of the relatively successful examples, because there have actually been many reversals, capture by agribusiness, expansion of public-private partnerships into these areas, reconsolidation of land that was originally given to smallholders and titles being sold. And many of these redistribution experiments have not necessarily been able to confront the wider capitalist system that exists in increasingly corporatized agriculture, and the failure of states very often to structure reform in favor of a more inclusive, redistributive approach has been a failure. What we learned from the East Asian experience is that actually strong state intervention to facilitate, steer, fund, subsidize, focus on and drive change in particular directions, whether in industrial development or through the process of agrarian reform, is crucial. And many states, particularly in the neoliberal era, neither have the willingness nor capacity to do that. But we also need to think about not just the numbers of areas transferred, but what actually has happened as a result. So not only is redistribution happening, 5 minutes, okay. Okay, we started late, but anyway, okay. We're,
8 minutes.
Give me 8, okay. Not only is redistribution happening, but also recalling Nancy Fraser's arguments about redistribution, recognition, and representation, there's more recognition for people on the land. So, as I mentioned, indigenous and Afro-descendant populations. More recognition for Adivasis and Dalits in India. And changing power relations that exist as a result of land being handed over to new people, such as the Panchayat reforms in West Bengal, or the rise of the landless peoples movement in Brazil, new forms of representation that exist. And as I've already mentioned in respect to Scotland, these redistributed spaces can be experimental experiments or alternatives, creating niches for transformation, new politics, new people in rural areas, thinking about new and different types of non-corporate agri-food systems. So how do we get redistributed land reform back onto the agenda? ICARRD, as I've already said, is a key moment. It's 2 weeks away. But the important thing about ICARRD is agrarian reform and rural development. And I think it's important to think about agrarian reform and redistribution linked to rural development more broadly. Because what we've seen, unlike in the East Asian cases that I mentioned, is that very often what happens is people get some land, but then the state doesn't come in or other private sector actors don't come in and support people in the transformative processes of agrarian change that need to happen afterwards. So how do we get this back onto the agenda? What should those who are going to Cartagena do and campaign for in the discussions there? First, I think we need to link land to this wider inequality agenda that seems to have found a place within wider debates about economies and development more broadly. Linking land and housing, land and taxation, redistribution, and wider questions of taxation, north and south. It shouldn't just be a land-rural sector thing. Addressing inequality is a much bigger, wider, economy-wide question. I think we need to offer some new and different, braver narratives around agriculture, technology, and the viability, in particularly of small-scale farming. That restructuring the large-scale corporate agriculture is not necessarily the disaster as some claim, that there is and can be a new vision for farming and food systems that is based on a different rationale. And third, a key lesson in each of our cases is we need to capture that moment where state commitment, bureaucratic capacity, citizen mobilization come together and powers shift. And we need to think politically about how that can happen. And finally, we need to combine redistribution with wider reform and rural development, linking redistribution with local economic growth, multipliers, linking to economic transformation. And again, I think there are a lot of lessons from East Asia where opportunities for partnership and mutual learning can take place. So I think this needs to go beyond the slightly bland principles of that FAO leaflet to something quite concrete, to think about how redistributed land reform can get back onto the agenda. So ICARRD, I think, has real potentials, but it has potential dangers. It has the potential, as I've tried to argue, for a progressive, undiluted statement backed by some of the key states that are present, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, that redistribution is essential for addressing inequality and spurring economic growth. But there are dangers, and that's the default, the fiddling at the edges, tenure reform, titling systems, land governance, etc., which has been the dominant mode of the last decade, without challenging those rather more fundamental structural inequalities that redistribution need to challenge. So in conclusion, it's great that so many people from PLAAS, from the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, and the ministerial team are all going to South Africa, actually from South Africa to Cartagena. So South Africa should be playing a leading role. So what can I say? Go forth, comrades. Good luck.
Thank you, Ian, for that rich discussion presentation. Colleagues, I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers. And for those who are joining online, you can type in your questions and then you can summarize them for the presenter. So this is a very critical moment here. I'm just thinking about the golden era of land reform that Henry Einstein spoke about. He was referring to state-led land reforms of the 1950s. And a lot of geopolitical shifts that we see. And I'm just wondering what you make of those kind of changes and the kind of impacts that they can have on redistributed land reforms globally. I know that the idea is to put them back on the agenda, but it's not happening in a vacuum. So, colleagues, if you have questions for Ian, I will take 3 questions at a time. You can introduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, Prof. My name is Kolotha. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cape Town in the Geography Department. My question, you might have dealt with it. I was listening online on my way. It's registration, so students are getting to it. So, but I wanted to ask, I think in the beginning, you mentioned sort of that one of the challenges is that some of this rhetoric about redistribution helping with inequality was not received well in a platform such as like PLAAS. And so I'm wondering, how do we ensure that we do not fall into the risk that many academics fall into, preaching to the already converted? So even when we think about South Africa, it is somewhat converted, whether it's rhetorically or in practice, we can discuss that. But how do we ensure that this becomes the mainstream in a diverse platform? So is it doing the 4 principles that you are outlining towards the end? Or what else is causing this disjunction? Because I do feel that in some cases, people are doing some of this work, but it's still not becoming mainstream. And then just a second one, just to clarify, you said that redistribution in Scotland has been slower than the other countries you have mentioned, and I just wanted to check that I heard that correctly, as I was thinking about that. Thank you.
Any other question, colleagues, or Ian? Yes, and thank you so.
Yes, I wanted to ask, is this really possible without the buy-in state? Because I've seen that there are many initiatives that are on the ground, but it's usually not much compared to instances where maybe there is a buy-in from the states. Because if you look at the outcomes of the first ICARRD, which is the voluntary guidelines, what also impeded success of the failure of the buy-in from us. So is this really possible without the states? And if not, then what ways can we use to capture the states so that it's able to push the progressive agenda?
Thank you, Kani. So we also have a question online. The question is around small-scale fisheries. How is there space for them? How can they use ICARRD as a conference at the moment to put the agenda on small-scale fisheries, given that much of the focus is on land reform, not necessarily water-related issues? Yeah, maybe you could respond to those questions.
Sure, and respond to your opening comment, Farai. I mean, I think the argument here, as I was trying to say, is not to go back to the golden age, as it were, because that was a very different time. It existed at a particular moment, and the moves towards land reform were pushed either by attempts at forms of socialist revolution, but also pushed by the United States in support of pushing back communist insurgency. So there were all sorts of momentum around that period. That geopolitical situation doesn't exist, but I think what we have found across these cases, and they're slightly random cases, but they are cases where land reform has happened, even in this last 30, 40 years, is that there has been considerable movements towards redistribution. And that somehow is surprising. So it raises the question that you are asking, is how to, as it were, galvanize those experiences and make them more mainstream. So I think one of the arguments that we've been having in this discussion is to try and make the case that actually land reform is not just about, and it is about, recognition and justice and redress of past inequalities, but it's also a potential positive contributor, as we've seen, over the longer term, if appropriately supported, towards transformations that result in economic growth and further industrialization. And that's the why I was raising the East Asia question. Now, I mean, the real danger of saying East Asia should just be translated to South Africa or something, that's just not going to happen. But what we should learn from that experience, I think, is that there are certain conditions around which redistribution can result in a particular pattern of economic growth, which is inclusive, it's broad-based, and it leads to wider processes of economic growth and industrialization. Now, that's not quite a Davos agenda, because Davos is premised on elite forms of capitalism. So maybe, maybe we'll leave Davos for a bit. But I think that argument is a potentially powerful one to countries, whether that's Scotland, the UK, or South Africa, Zimbabwe, Bolivia, wherever, who are wanting to create a platform for inclusive economic growth, which is not necessarily all agrarian and not all agrarian for all time, but is rooted in a base that starts with an agrarian setting. So that would be my argument for the mainstream. And you asked about Scotland. I mean, proportionately, the Scottish land reform is probably smaller than other countries, but it's a much smaller country, so I haven't done the statistic. But it's a case where, rather like South Africa in a way, where it isn't a fully agrarian society, it's a massively unequal land ownership pattern. And Scotland and South Africa have some similarities in that respect. But there isn't a huge number of people living on the land and wanting more land in order to do more agriculture. So the land reforms that have happened in Scotland have been these community rights to buy, whereby an estate comes onto the market, and often these are massive estates, and communities have the opportunity to raise funds and put money down as the first option in order to acquire that land for community use. It's a very particular type of land reform, and it hasn't gone very far. But as I said, even if things are quite small, and in statistical terms, some could say insignificant, they can be the focus for galvanizing a different way of thinking. And I think the land movement and the land workers movement in Scotland that we learned from at the Cape Town conference, and I'm doing this all second-hand because I haven't worked on the Scottish situation, can provide us some experiments, some prefiguring, if you like, of alternatives that could exist and show that there can be a different way of living in and making use of rural spaces. Was that all the questions? Was there another? Oh, no. Yeah, the state, yeah. So the argument around the state is yeah, sure. The state needs to be centrally part, and all these experiences that I documented have had state involvement, but it doesn't need to be the whole state. It can be parts of the state, configurations within the state, even within the bureaucracy, where some of these experiments can be pushed with the evidence of social movements. So when we've analysed these so-called conjunctures, where alliances between the state, between citizens, between bureaucracies, those moments occur only at certain moments where those possibilities open up. And those need to be seized. But these are not going to be, and we're not going to see a repeat, I suspect, of, again, the golden age, the classic. The state says we're going to eliminate the landlords and take over the land. This is not going to happen. It's going to be much more incremental, much more negotiated, much more politically contested. But equally, by arguing that the state should be involved, it shouldn't be in control. The big danger is a technocratic state, is South Africa, can implement land reform in a way that actually undermines the capacity of land reform to have all the benefits that we were talking about, because it has a very particular bureaucratic idea and technocratic idea of what land reform and farming should be, disallowing the opportunity to allow innovations in what new land uses might be. So it's a both and answer to your question.
Thanks, Ian. So I think you have responded to the first round of questions. And
I
now,
get a tick for that.
yeah. So,
Oh, no, we didn't respond to the fisheries one. Exactly. Yeah. So the fisheries one, I mean, Maniva, you should respond to that. I was trying to read what does this say? It said fisheries, underlined twice, but I couldn't read my writing. Because I think, you know, the fisheries debate, the forestry debate should be seen in parallel and as part of this question about how redistributions happen. They're going to happen in different ways because the material basis of each of these resources is different. But that's why I think it's really important and why the ICARRD is bringing together fisheries, forestry, agriculture, food, all together in one debate, and why we need to see them together and not see them as separate. Because very often in our sort of sectoral worlds, we say, oh, well, that's a fisheries problem, oh, that's an agricultural problem, oh, that's a forestry problem. But actually underneath, I don't know whether you agree, Maniva, that some of the basic principles are exactly the same.
Can I?
Yeah, you should.
I think, you know, just looking at your timeline from 2006 and then the voluntary guidelines on forestry, fisheries and wara were all launched after that. And I think from that moment, there was an effort from social movements and the IPC to bring fisheries into the land and rural development forestry debates. Before that, it was quite siloed in terms of social movements. So via La Via Campesina and concepts like food sovereignty, there was a connecting group forming in terms of challenging some of these debates from different lenses, from fisheries, from forestry, and from land. And I think it is more the progressive fisher movements that are moving towards that. But I still see generally outside that La Via Campesina IPC movement that there are any other movement towards bringing together both land and fisheries more in form of commons. So I think that is missing, and there's a movement more towards blue economy, World Bank, you know, everything is blue kind of analysis and just jumping on the bandwagon. And I think ICARRD is the space to kind of bring that together and to kind of make it a little bit more solid in moving ahead with those different connections, bringing land, water, rivers, fisheries, forestry in the debate, and with social movements, academia, and governments. I think governments are not anywhere closer to bringing that together, but I think it is the social movement, I can see La Via Campesina that are driving that for me. And we also have our own fisheries, small-scale fisheries guidelines that are almost a copy and paste of many of the voluntary guidelines for the VGGT guidelines. Is a copy and paste when it comes to governance. So I think that there are also problems with that. So I think it is an opportunity to strengthen that, and I think it's an opportunity for social movement, governments, and academia to make that shift. I agree, and that's why I'm going.
That's why you're going. Good. Good. No, I mean, I agree entirely. And the important thing about ICARRD as a platform, as Ward said in that quote that I gave right at the beginning, as a platform, it does provide space for all of those groups to come together. It's not just a governmental process, it's one that involves academia, involves social movements and others. And I hope that some focus around the redistributed agenda can bring some coalescing between those groups and not leave them siloed.
Thanks, Modiba and Ian. So I'm just going to summarize a couple of questions from our colleagues who are online. So the first question is from Rob Childs. He's asking if land reform, the extent to which land reform and state support for smallholder farmers is compatible with progressive, with capitalist structures, basically. To what extent can we pursue redistributive land reform in favor of smallholder farmers in the current context where capitalism is trade? And then the second question is, does land reform always need to be about economic growth? How about re-establishing livelihoods and issues of belonging, identity, and culture? So those are very specific questions. Yeah, I think we can address those ones.
Sure, no, they're good questions, both. So in response to Rob's question, as I said, the existing pattern of corporate control of agriculture and land is such that you're pushing against powerful interests. But equally, one has to make the case that smallholder systems are very much embedded in capitalist systems. And they are market driven. They are part and parcel of dynamic economic settings. You only have to look to the consequences of land reform in Zimbabwe to see that again and again. So it means, well, what type of capitalism? And capitalism for who? So let's disaggregate that. For sure, the penetration of corporate agriculture, as I started the talk with, is extreme. The powerful billionaires that control both land and discourse, if you like, are have substantial power. But how to push back against that? That is the question of the alliances that need to be formed to imagine a different type of capitalist relationship. So it's not easy, but the redistributions that we're talking about can deliver that type of economic growth that we're talking about. Now, I agree entirely with the second point. The reason that I've been emphasizing the link between redistribution and wider economic growth is that I think that that's a very important argument for situating this redistributive debate within wider policy discourses. Because unless we can make that case, that this goes beyond justice and redress, which are absolutely, and cultural rights and so on, which are absolutely essential, then we end up with this concessionary approach to redistribution, which is about, oh, well, just have a little bit of restituted land. Oh, well, have a little bit of culturally appropriate this and that. Not saying that these people are central economic actors themselves with bringing with them cultural understandings of land and livelihoods and so on, but can contribute centrally to the future of economies. So I don't think it's almost a strategic question of where you start the argument. I think there are important ways, and this is where we conclude our paper. Ruth wrote this bit, I can't remember it now, that if you're evaluating the success of redistributive land reform, there are many different criteria. There are economic criteria. What does it do to the economy? What does it do to productivity? What does it do to employment? There are criteria that are around belonging and identity. How does it build the sense of home and place and cultural association? And then there are a variety of other criteria that allow us to think about food and farming futures? How does this redistribution, as it were, suggest an alternative to corporate agriculture? Does it improve health and nutrition outcomes for the poor? Does it care for the environment? And to what extent, and there will be criteria that around politics. Does it confront elite power? Does it create new forms of class configurations that allow the countryside to look different politically? And how does that affect these wider struggles in relation to the state in mobilizing for more progressive alternatives? I think we have to think about all of those criteria that are economic, around justice, around identity, I found a bit now, food and rural futures, and around politics. We have to think about them all together. And they're not separate. They have to be thought about all together, and no single metric will do.
Thanks, Ian. Any other questions, colleagues? I think we are going to end the session in a minute. Then Monica, just introduce yourselves, and then Frank. Yeah.
Come on. You've got to ask a question. You can't sit there.
One way to understand world since World War II would be in the North you have the golden age of capitalism from the 50s through to the 70s, massive rates of growth, and the birth of that area of development and the prospering of social democratic countries in the North. Whereas the South is an era of decolonization and revolution. But since the 70s, we've had a different period where economic growth has not been so easy to attain. And as the decades have gone by, this liberal version of neoliberalism has allowed, has suggested we need to rethink development. But I think what we see right now is a further shift away from liberal neoliberalism to authoritarian neoliberalism. So we have a very different kind of capitalism today than we had over the last 30 years and before that, since the Second World War. And so I think we have to put the redistribution debate in that larger context of global political economies and geopolitical shifts which are taking place. And I'm a little bit skeptical about the idea that we can go back to the neoliberal era or even the 50s. I'm not sure history allows us to reverse like that. I think we're in for a very difficult period where those figures Ian put at the beginning are quite startling, right? The degree of inequality in the world, which by the way coincides with the climate crisis, which is very urgent, coincides with a crisis not just of inequality but of poverty too, prompting massive migration around the world, and a crisis of the state, the democratic capitalist state. And these things are all interlinked with one another. So I would suggest that redistribution needs to be placed in a slightly different context, which is a much more fundamental remaking of global society and modern society. And I'm not going to put the word socialist to that because nobody knows what that means anymore. It will certainly involve markets, but I'm not certain that we can call it capitalism either. So I think current debate has to be much more fundamental about rethinking society at large and how we live on this planet with billions of people in the world today. So this is a comment.
Thank you, Juanita. Over to you.
I'm not sure if it's a comment or question to you, but I'd like your thoughts on this again. Gaza and redistribution and ICARRD. I feel that even the Cape Town statement, criticism to ourselves, has been soft on making a statement on what's happening in Gaza. So when we look at the road to ICARRD, to what extent would there be any there's a lot of solidarity and recognition, but in terms of redistribution, isn't that a good test case for us to start thinking about what is needed and what needs to be done? is my thinking. So I don't know if it's just a chronic self-criticism of our Cape Town declaration, but also your thoughts on connecting that the issue in Gaza, a real life issue in Gaza, and the redistribution, land redistribution. I think it's the test case of our time.
Mm.
Thank you, Moni. Frank?
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Frank Matos. I'm from the University of Cape Town. I'm just wondering whether it's a comment or a provocation or whatever it is. Especially around your final thoughts over the issue, new planning issue, I guess links to what Ben was saying earlier in terms of the issue. The question then becomes, who is leading this envisioning process? You know, given all this kind of disparities, how did then put it in authoritarian capitalist system that is emerging? Who is to create this space for visioning the future? Especially given the fact that we tend to be in a space as academics, even though we purport to be activist in the process, but it's quite a different reality when, you know, local populations are fighting for rights, be it fisheries, land, etc., etc. And I, you know, for fighting for justice, you know, redress and so on. Who is to lead the process given the fact that state is becoming something else? Capitalism is becoming something else. And civil society, so ways the new process of envisioning in society that we would like to see, or that disenfranchised local populations would like to arrive, who is to drive the process. It's something that I'm struggling, you know, coming to the end of my life shortly. But
Oh, right.
I've been at this for 40 years. You know, I don't have 40 years ahead of me. That's the point. Where I'm going is much shorter. And we've been debating these things and dealing with them ad nauseam. Where to from it? That's the question. So I'm just asking us to think together to say, yeah, we've had these struggles, we've written, we've what, you know, where to from it? Really, that's the thought.
Thank you, Frank. Ian, over to you.
Well, there's a huge, big comments, possible, because you want to say.
No, just two quick ones. So one version of what Frank and Ben are raised reminds me of Samir Amin's notion of sovereign development, where states in the south actually create sufficient room and space for them to define their own path of development to address inequality and so on. Now, the question that's playing in my mind, what conditions are required for that sovereign path of development, and what potential actually exists in key states in the global south? And when I look at South Africa, I just get sad because I cannot see the possibility of that. Then the final, which is now a question for you, Ian. You referred to non-state, non-corporate farms, almost pushing a small farmer line. When you were raising that, I was just thinking of that paper from John Senna, where basically he's quite dismissive of anything outside of certain conditions met by big farmers, but you can't really defend the big farming model. The reason I'm raising that is a constant question. The alternatives from below, to what extent can they really be systemic in challenging the whole range of agricultural systems, of production systems, of value chains, and so on?
Well, big questions. I would expect it from you four anyway. What else? Well, let me just deal with that last one. I mean, you know, this is an ongoing debate, and you know, the Johnson and Sender argument about whatever it was, mass destruction, whatever, I can't remember the name.
With
But,
mass production.
yeah. I mean, they took a particular stance on large-scale farms, which is common within sort of classical Marxist analysis, that the ultimate endpoint of a particular pathway of capitalism. But there is plenty of evidence from around the world that small-scale farmers still feed very significant proportion of the world's population and can, in the right circumstances, contribute to this wider economic transformation. So I think it's an open debate. There are particular structural conditions within South Africa, which they were talking about, which makes that transformation more difficult, maybe impossible. But this is not necessarily the case everywhere. In fact, even in Europe and elsewhere, despite the fact that there is a big challenge. And it relates to the challenge that Ben was saying, is that the existing structures of capitalism and power and authority have shifted in a way that have concentrated power and ownership in a particular way that makes it very difficult to challenge. But that, you can either just analyze that and throw up your hands, which may be a rational response, or say, well, where are what are the discourses, what are the alliances, what are the strategies that can help shift that debate, even in this most unlikely of circumstances. And I'm not saying that, yes, we have to recreate the 1950s. Going back in history, obviously, it doesn't make sense, or even transporting models from one part of the world to another doesn't make sense. But we can learn lessons from history and learn lessons that can be quite relevant to us now. So I'm less despairing than you, Ben, but I equally accept that the political moment now is certainly not conducive to a lot of these opportunities. But that said, the opportunities to create what Maniba and others were talking about, this moment of coming together, where civil society movements, academics, governments, particularly progressive governments, can come together around a new way of framing things. ICARRD could be an important moment, and that's why all the effort has gone in from our comrades in Colombia to host this global event. And it is a significant moment where a new narrative, a new sense of solidarity, perhaps some new coalitions between states and between civil society movements could emerge. And that's why I mentioned South Africa, not that South Africa is ready to do a lot of this on its home turf, but it might be a significant player in an international coalition of people, of groups of people, groups of countries outside the global north that can offer a different alternative way of thinking. So 2 weeks' time is a key moment, and I think what those of you who are there, the temptation will be to enter that sort of UN style. Sorry, comrades from the FAO who are online. That UN style, everything gets flattened out type consensus C type blandness. Whereas actually there's a real opportunity to have a really focused, radical position that's developed. Gaza, I think, or Palestine more generally, because the West Bank, of course, is equally relevant to the land redistribution question because of the settlement question, settlement issue, is I think absolutely how did you put it, the test case of our time. It really does bring all of these issues to the fore. A particular type of authoritarian, non-democratic imposition by in this case, an alien state, massive inequality in land redistribution, which has resulted in hideous amounts of violence and death, and also a sort of modernist plan by Trump and his colleagues for refashioning of this land in a totally different way. Well, surely there should be some debate about what the alternatives are, led by people from Gaza and the West Bank. So I think it really is a test case of our time, and I hope it will be central to the discussions of ICARRD. And although not in such a traumatizing and terrible moment, there are many other similar parallels to what's been happening there, of expropriations, of dispossessions, of violence associated with land, which need to come together as part of that wider debate. So I think in answer to your question, Frank, where did the vision come? Who's leading all of this? I think ICARRD can potentially become a moment. Potentially, I say. It's up to you guys who are going to make the potential real, where some of these coalitions of forces can come together, governments, civil society groups, academics and others who can really come up with a new narrative that doesn't necessarily have to follow what I've just said here, but is appropriate to the current moment, that really does tackle some of these bigger questions in a radical way that allows us to rethink what land is for, how it's situated within wider economies, and what transformations through redistribution can result. And then I think we can shift from that slightly depressed view from Simon's time to something a little bit something and from UCB to something a little bit more positive, because unless we have some hope and we can galvanize that hope around moments like this, then yeah, we might as well give up. But we're not going to yet. Anyway. Well, thank you, Farai. We've gone on far longer than we said, but anyway, hey.
Yes, thank you, Ian. A round of applause.